Welcome, dear viewers. For more exclusive, thrilling stories every week, join our membership. Sit back, relax, and sip your coffee. Enjoy. The old drive-in sits at the edge of nowhere, surrounded by cornfields that whisper in the wind. Most nights, I'm alone in the projection booth, watching movies flicker across the giant screen. But sometimes, when the fog rolls in thick, cars appear in the lot that were never there when I locked the gates. And the films I play start showing scenes I never loaded. Scenes of people I know, doing things they shouldn't be doing. Out here, where the darkness stretches for miles, I've learned that not everything on the screen is fiction. My name's Danny Kowalski, and I've been running the Starlight Drive-In outside Mooresville for 3 years now. This place has been here since 1952, back when families would pack into their Buicks and watch John Wayne pictures under the stars. Now it's mostly teenagers in rusted pickups, and the occasional family trying to recapture something they never really had. I ended up here after my divorce. Chicago got too expensive, too loud, too full of reminders of what I'd lost. My buddy Jake mentioned this job, said the owner needed someone who wouldn't ask too many questions about the late hours or the weird equipment. The pay was decent, and the tiny apartment above Henderson's Hardware on Main Street was cheap enough that I could actually save money for once. Mooresville's the kind of town where everybody knows everybody, but they still lock their doors at night. Population 9,326, home to the Indianapolis Motor Speedway's little brother, and 3 churches for every bar. The drive-in sits 2 miles east of town on County Road 350, surrounded by the Kerner family farm on 3 sides. Old Amy O'Kerner sold that land to the original owner for a song back in the day, and his grandson still farms right up to our fence line. The projection booth is a cramped metal box 20 feet off the ground, accessible only by a rusted ladder that sways in the wind. Inside, there's barely room for the aging 35mm projectors, a space heater that only works when it wants to, and a folding chair I bought at a garage sale. The concession stand below is run by Betty Hoffman, a 60-something widow who makes the best popcorn in Morgan County and pretends not to notice when kids sneak in through the back fence. Most nights are routine. Load the film, check the sound system, wait for cars to filter in around sunset. Betty handles the snacks while I manage the technical side. We usually get maybe 30 cars on weeknights, double that on weekends. Horror movies bring the biggest crowds, kids wanting to get scared in the dark, couples looking for an excuse to ignore the screen. But some nights are different. Nights when the fog creeps in from the White River and the temperature drops 10 degrees for no reason. Nights when I count the cars in the lot and get a different number each time. Nights when the movies I load aren't the movies that play. That's when the rules matter. Betty left them taped inside the projection booth when she trained me, written in her careful cursive on yellowed notebook paper. 7 rules that seemed silly until I learned what happens when you break them. It was my second week when Betty first mentioned the rules. October had settled over Indiana like a heavy blanket, bringing early darkness and the kind of crisp air that made your breath visible. We were showing a double feature, The Exorcist followed by Halloween, and the lot was packed with teenagers ready to test their courage. "Danny, you got a minute?" Betty called up to the booth during the intermission between films. I climbed down the ladder, grateful for the chance to stretch my legs. She was wiping down the concession counter, but her movements seemed distracted. "What's on your mind, Betty?" She glanced around the empty concession stand, then pulled a folded piece of notebook paper from beneath the register. The paper was yellow with age, the edges soft from handling. "I should have given you these sooner, but I was hoping." She paused, studying my face. "Well, I was hoping you'd quit before you needed them. Most folks do. I took the paper and unfolded it. 7 rules were written in blue ink, the handwriting neat, but hurried. 1. Never start the second film before 9:17 p.m., even if customers complain. 2. If a car arrives after the gates are locked, ignore it. Do not acknowledge the occupants. 3. Check the lot count every hour. If the number changes without explanation, stay in the booth until dawn. 4. Never look directly at the screen during the 23rd minute of any horror film. 5. If Betty leaves early, lock the concession stand and do not go inside until morning. 6. Cars without headlights should be treated as empty spaces. 7. If someone knocks on the booth door after midnight, respond only if they know your middle name. I read through them twice, waiting for Betty to laugh and admit it was some kind of joke. Instead, she kept cleaning the same spot on the counter. Betty, what is this? Rules that'll keep you safe. Her voice was matter of fact, like she was explaining how to thread the projector. Old Hank wrote them down before he retired. Said his father told him the same things when he started working here in '73. Come on. Cars without headlights? Knocking after midnight? This sounds like something kids would make up to scare the new guy. Betty stopped wiping and looked at me directly. In the dim light from the concession stand, her eyes seemed older than her 60-odd years. 2 weeks ago, you asked me why we never have trouble with kids sneaking in, why we never get vandalism or break-ins like other theaters. She folded the dish rag carefully. It's because this place has an understanding with other things. Follow the rules and you'll be fine. Break them. Break them in what? Asked Tommy Breslin. I knew that name. Tommy had worked here the summer before I arrived. Betty mentioned him once, said he'd quit suddenly without giving notice. Where's Tommy now? Morgan County Hospital, psychiatric ward. Betty's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Been there since August, keeps talking about movies that showed him dying over and over, different ways each time. Outside, car engines were starting up as people headed home after the first film. I could hear teenagers laughing, radios playing, the ordinary sounds of a Friday night. Betty, this is crazy. You're talking about... I'm talking about keeping you safe. She reached under the counter and pulled out a thermos. Coffee's fresh. You're going to need it. Need it for what? She nodded toward the lot. Count the cars. I climbed back up to the booth and looked out through the projection window. The lot held maybe 40 vehicles, scattered across the gravel in loose rows. I counted them carefully. 38 cars and 2 pickup trucks. 40 total. The second film started at 9:17 exactly. I'd checked my watch 3 times to make sure. Halloween flickered to life on the massive screen, and the remaining audience settled in for another round of scares. 20 minutes into the film, I remembered rule number 4. The 23rd minute was approaching. I turned away from the screen, focusing instead on the equipment dials and gauges. The projector hummed steadily, film feeding through at 24 frames per second. At the 23rd minute mark, something changed. The booth felt colder, and I could hear sounds that weren't coming from the film's audio track. Whispers, footsteps on gravel, car doors slamming in a rhythm that didn't match the movie. I kept my eyes on the projector, watching the film advance frame by frame. When the 24th minute began, the strange sounds faded. 45 minutes later, I counted the cars again. 42. 2 additional vehicles had appeared in the back row, a sedan with no license plate and an old station wagon with wood paneling. Both sat perfectly still, no movement visible inside. No headlights, no interior lights, no sign of occupants. I grabbed the binoculars Betty kept in the booth and focused on the newcomers. The sedan's windshield reflected the movie screen, but the reflection showed a different film. Not Halloween, but something grainy and colorless, like old home movies. I could make out figures moving in the reflected image, but couldn't distinguish details. The station wagon was worse. Its windshield was completely black, as if someone had painted the glass from the inside. I set down the binoculars and checked my watch. 11:30 p.m. Still 30 minutes until midnight. The rules said to stay in the booth until dawn if the car count changed, but dawn was 7 hours away. Outside, the legitimate moviegoers seemed oblivious to the phantom vehicles. A couple in the front row was sharing popcorn. 3 teenagers in a Camaro were barely watching the screen, too busy talking and laughing. But something was wrong with their laughter. It carried on the wind, reaching the booth despite the distance and the movie's soundtrack. And it sounded like an echo, as if their voices were bouncing off something that wasn't there. I pulled out my phone to call Betty, then remembered she'd left right after intermission. Early departure. Rule number 5 said to lock the concession stand. Looking down, I could see the concession stand door standing wide open. The concession stand door swayed gently in the October breeze, creaking on hinges that Betty kept meaning to oil. From the projection booth, I could see straight through to the back wall where the popcorn machine sat silent, its yellow light still glowing. Rule 5 was clear. If Betty leaves early, lock the concession stand and don't go inside until morning. But she'd left it open, which meant either she'd forgotten, unlikely for someone as careful as Betty, or something had prevented her from securing it. I checked my watch. 11:47 p.m. 13 minutes until midnight, when Rule 7 would become relevant. The movie still had 40 minutes left to run, and the phantom cars remained in the back row, motionless as tombstones. My phone showed no bars. Cell service out here was spotty on good days, worthless during weather. Tonight, with the fog starting to creep in from the river bottoms, I might as well have been carrying a paperweight. The teenagers in the Camaro were getting restless. I watched them through the binoculars as they climbed out of their car and started walking toward the concession stand. 3 kids, 2 boys and a girl, maybe 17 or 18 years old. The girl wore a Mooresville High Letterman jacket that belonged to one of the boys. They reached the concession stand and stopped at the open door. Even from 20 feet up, I could see them hesitating. The girl pointed inside and said something to her companions. One of the boys shook his head and backed away, but the other one, the owner of the jacket, stepped through the doorway. He emerged 30 seconds later, moving faster than he'd gone in. All 3 kids hurried back to their car, and within minutes they were driving toward the exit, taillights disappearing into the corn. That left 39 cars in the lot. I counted them again to be sure. 37 legitimate vehicles plus the 2 phantoms. The numbers were shifting, and I didn't like what that meant. At 11:52, I heard footsteps on the gravel below. Slow, even steps that crunched with each footfall. I looked down, but saw no one walking between the cars. The footsteps continued, circling the base of the projection booth tower. The ladder began to shake. Someone was climbing up. The old metal rungs groaned under weight, and I could hear breathing, labored, like someone who wasn't used to physical exertion. The ascent took longer than it should have, as if whoever was climbing kept stopping to rest. Rule 7 echoed in my mind. If someone knocks on the booth door after midnight, respond only if they know your middle name. But it wasn't midnight yet, and no one was knocking. They were climbing. I grabbed the heaviest thing within reach, a spare film reel, and positioned myself beside the door. The footsteps on the ladder grew closer. Whoever was climbing had nearly reached the booth level. Then the climbing stopped. I waited, film reel raised, but no knock came. Instead, I heard a sound like fingernails scraping against metal, as if someone was feeling around the outside of the booth, searching for something. My watch read 11:58. The scraping moved around the booth's exterior, following the walls. When it reached the projection window, I saw fingers, pale and too long, feeling along the glass. The fingers found the window's edge and began working at the seal, trying to pry it open. I backed away from the window, but there wasn't far to go in the cramped booth. The projector kept running, casting Halloween's final scenes across the screen. But I couldn't look away from those fingers working at the glass. 11:59. The fingers stopped moving. Whatever was outside the booth had gone completely still. I held my breath and listened, but even the scraping had ceased. The only sounds were the projector's mechanical hum and the movie's soundtrack drifting up from below. Midnight arrived with the distant chime of the courthouse clock in town, carried on the wind across 2 miles of farmland. 3 seconds later, someone knocked on the booth door. The knock was polite. 3 measured raps, like a neighbor asking to borrow sugar. I set down the film reel and approached the door, but didn't open it. "Who's there?" "Hello, Danny." The voice was Betty's, but wrong somehow. Too cheerful, like someone imitating her tone without understanding the emotion behind it. "I forgot to lock up the concession stand. Could you help me with that?" I pressed my ear to the door. "What's my middle name, Betty?" Silence stretched for long seconds. When the voice returned, it sounded frustrated, less like Betty than before. "I don't understand why you need to know that. It's me, Betty. You've seen me every night for 3 weeks." "My middle name," I repeated. "Danny? Thomas?" The uncertainty was obvious now. "Danny Michael? I'm sorry, I'm not good with names." Betty knew my middle name. I'd filled out tax forms in front of her, and she'd made a joke about it being the same as her late husband's. Daniel Eugene Kowalski. Eugene was her husband's name, too. "Go away," I said to the door. The thing outside laughed, and it didn't sound like Betty at all anymore. The laugh was wet and hollow, like water gurgling down a drain. "That's not very friendly, Danny. I just want to come inside where it's warm." "Go away." The laughter stopped. I heard footsteps moving across the booth's metal roof. Then the scraping returned, this time above my head. Whatever was up there was heavy enough to make the entire structure sway. I looked out through the projection window at the lot below. The movie was ending, credits rolling across the screen, but none of the remaining cars were starting their engines. They sat perfectly still, as if everyone inside had fallen asleep simultaneously. The phantom cars were still there, but now there were 3 of them. A pickup truck had joined the sedan and station wagon, parked at an angle that blocked the exit road. Something was moving in the corn. At first, I thought it was just the wind pushing through the stalks, but the movement was too regular, too purposeful. Shapes were walking through the field, approaching the drive-in from 3 directions. They moved in single file, like people following the path, but there was no path through the Kerner corn. I grabbed the binoculars and focused on the nearest line of figures. They were too far away to make out clearly, but their movement was wrong, too smooth, like they were gliding rather than walking, and they were all the same height, as if they'd been cut from the same template. The scraping on the roof intensified. Now it sounded like multiple sets of claws working at the metal, trying to tear through. The entire booth shuddered with each impact. I needed to get out of there, but the ladder was the only way down, and something had climbed up it to reach me. The figures in the corn were getting closer, and the cars in the lot remained ominously still. My watch showed 12:17 a.m. Dawn was still 6 hours away. The projection equipment was still running, though the movie had ended. The screen now showed white static, but in that static, I could see shapes moving. Not random patterns, but deliberate forms, the same figures I'd spotted in the corn, but these were walking across the screen itself, leaving footprints in the static. One of the screen figures turned toward the projection booth and waved. That's when I realized the scraping on the roof had stopped. Whatever had been up there was gone, but I could hear new sounds from below. Car doors opening and closing, footsteps on gravel, voices calling to each other in languages I didn't recognize. The phantom audience was arriving. I turned off the projector, plunging the screen into darkness, but the sounds continued. More car doors, more voices, more footsteps circling the booth. Through the projection window, I could see lights moving between the cars, not headlights or flashlights, but something that glowed with its own cold luminescence. The concession stand door slammed shut with a bang that echoed across the lot. Someone had finally locked it from the inside. The voices below grew louder, overlapping in conversations that made no sense. I pressed my face to the projection window and tried to make out what was happening in the lot, but the phantom lights moved in patterns that hurt to follow, like trying to track fireflies in a thunderstorm. The legitimate cars, the ones that had been there when the movie started, sat empty now. Doors hung open, interior lights casting weak yellow pools on the gravel, but I could see no sign of the people who'd been watching the film. The teenagers, the couples, the families, all gone, as if they'd simply evaporated. A new sound joined the chaos below. Music. Carnival music. The kind that played from old merry-go-rounds, but played at the wrong speed. Too slow, each note dragging like a record running down. The melody was familiar. The Entertainer. The same tune the ice cream truck played when it drove through Mooresville's neighborhoods. But hearing it now, distorted and stretched, made my teeth ache. I turned away from the window and checked the projection equipment. Everything was powered down, but the screen outside had begun glowing again. Not with static this time, but with images. Real images. The Kuhner farm appeared on the massive screen, filmed from ground level as if someone was walking through the corn rows. The camera work was shaky, amateur, like home movies shot with an old camcorder. I could see the farmhouse in the distance, dark except for a single light in an upstairs window. The camera turned toward the drive-in, and I realized whoever was filming was standing in the corn, looking at the theater from the same spot where I'd seen the figures moving earlier. The booth appeared on screen, 20 feet high and lit from within. I could see myself through the projection window, looking exactly as I was at that moment, pressed against the glass, watching the screen. But there was someone else in the booth with me. On screen, a figure stood directly behind me, close enough to touch. Tall, wearing what looked like an old theater usher's uniform. Red jacket with gold braiding, black bow tie, white gloves. The figure's face was in shadow, but I could see it was looking at the same screen I was watching, creating an endless loop of observation. I spun around. The booth was empty. Just me, the projector, and the folding chair. When I looked back at the screen, the camera had moved closer to the drive-in. Now it was filming from inside the lot, weaving between the abandoned cars. The image quality had improved, becoming crisp and clear despite the late hour. Every detail was visible. License plates, bumper stickers, forgotten items left on dashboards. The camera stopped at a familiar car, the Camaro that had belonged to the teenagers who'd fled earlier, but they were back now, sitting in their seats as if they'd never left. The girl was eating popcorn from a striped container, the boys were drinking sodas, and all three were watching the screen intently. But their eyes were wrong. Completely white, like eggs, with no pupils or irises visible. The camera moved on, visiting each car in turn. Every vehicle that had been empty was now occupied again, but the occupants shared the same blank, white eyes. They sat perfectly still, hands folded in their laps, faces turned toward the screen where their own images were being displayed. A new voice joined the carnival music, a man's voice, amplified as if speaking through the drive-in's PA system. But our PA system was ancient, hadn't worked properly in years. Betty always said it would take a miracle to get clear sound out of those old speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to tonight's special presentation. The voice was smooth, professional, like a 1950s radio announcer. We have a wonderful program planned for your viewing pleasure. I looked for the PA controls, but they were dead, same as always. The voice was coming from somewhere else, broadcasting directly to the speakers through some method I couldn't identify. Our feature presentation tonight is a documentary, the announcer continued, a true story about a young man who thought he could learn the rules of a place without understanding its history. On screen, the camera had found its way back to the projection booth. Now it was filming from inside, showing me hunched over the equipment, frantically checking dials and switches. But this version of me was different. Older, thinner, with hair that had gone white at the temples. This version of me wore the same red usher's jacket I'd seen on the figure behind me. The Starlight Drive-In has been operating for over 70 years, the announcer said, but it's only been showing the same movie for the last 40. The screen changed, showing the theater as it had looked decades ago. Cars from the 1960s filled the lot, Impalas and Fairlanes and Mustangs in pristine condition. Families sat on blankets beside their vehicles, children playing between the cars while parents watched the screen. But the movie they were watching was familiar. A home video of someone walking through cornfields, approaching a drive-in theater. The same footage I'd been watching minutes earlier. Each new projectionist believes they're the first to discover our little secret, the voice continued. They all think they're special, chosen, somehow different from the ones who came before. More images flashed across the screen, different projectionists in the booth over the years. Old Hank, whom Betty had mentioned. A younger man with thick glasses and a nervous smile. A woman in overalls with grease-stained hands. Tommy Breslin, looking exactly as I remembered him from his employee photo. All of them wearing the red usher's jacket. The rules exist for a reason, Daniel Eugene Kowalski. Not to protect you from us, but to teach you your place in our performance. The use of my full name made my skin crawl. I'd never told anyone at the theater my middle name except Betty, and she was the only person who could have passed that information along. But Betty was gone, and the thing that had pretended to be her hadn't known it. Rule number 7, the announcer said, exists to identify those who belong here, those who've earned the right to join our permanent cast. On screen, the camera showed the concession stand from inside. Betty was there, but not the Betty I knew. This Betty was younger, maybe in her 30s, wearing a vintage uniform that matched the drive-in's original branding. She was making popcorn with practiced efficiency, but her movements were too fluid, like a dancer performing a routine she'd perfected over decades. Betty Hoffman has been our concession manager since 1962, the voice explained. She's grown quite fond of the position. The Betty on screen looked up at the camera and smiled. Her eyes were the same white, featureless orbs I'd seen in the cars, but her smile was genuine, warm, almost maternal. Each projectionist lasts about 3 years, the announcer continued, long enough to learn the rules, to understand their importance, to become part of our family. Tonight marks the beginning of your transition, Danny. The screen showed the booth again, but now I could see other figures inside with me. They stood in a semicircle around the projector, all the previous projectionists, wearing their red jackets, their faces peaceful and content. Their eyes had gone white like the others, but they seemed happy, fulfilled in a way I'd never been in my previous life. "You came here running from failure," the voice said, and I realized it was no longer coming from the speakers. The announcer was standing behind me, speaking directly into my ear. "A failed marriage, a failed career, a failed life. We offer you purpose, Danny. Permanence. A place where you truly belong." I turned around slowly. The figure in the red jacket was there, solid and real, standing in the impossible space between the projector and the wall. Up close, I could see his face clearly. It was my face, but older, more refined, with the confidence I'd always lacked. "The rules weren't meant to keep you safe," he said, his voice matching the announcer's perfectly. "They were meant to prepare you, to teach you discipline, attention to detail, respect for tradition. All the qualities you'll need in your new position." "What position?" "Senior projectionist," he said, gesturing toward the window. "Head of operations. You'll train the next candidate when they arrive, help them understand the rules, guide them through their 3-year apprenticeship, just as Betty guided you." I looked out at the lot. The phantom cars were gone, replaced by vehicles I recognized from decades past. The audience sat in neat rows, all facing the screen, all with those same white, peaceful eyes. They were waiting for something, waiting for me to make a choice. "What happens if I refuse?" "You can't refuse," he said, but not unkindly. "You already accepted when you read the rules, when you followed them, when you stayed in the booth despite every instinct telling you to run." He was right. I'd had opportunities to leave. When Betty first showed me the rules, when the phantom cars appeared, when the fake Betty came knocking. But I'd stayed, following each rule exactly as written, playing my part in their performance. "Tommy Breslin tried to refuse," I said. "Tommy broke rule number 4, he replied. He looked directly at the screen during the 23rd minute of The Exorcist. He saw his own future, his own transformation, and it frightened him. So we let him leave, but we couldn't let him remember correctly. His mind filled in the gaps with trauma, with horror stories that made more sense than the truth. And if I agree, you'll be happier than you've ever been. You'll have purpose, belonging, a family that will never abandon you." He gestured toward the window again. "Look at them, Danny. Really look." I pressed my face to the glass and focused on the audience below. Their white eyes weren't blank or empty. They were full of contentment, of peace. They'd found what they were looking for, what everyone was looking for, a place where they truly belonged. The red jacket appeared on the chair beside me, perfectly fitted, waiting for me to put it on. I reached for the red jacket, then stopped. My fingers hovered inches from the fabric, but something held me back. Not fear, but a stubborn voice in my head that sounded like my father. "Never take the first offer," he used to say when we'd go to car lots or furniture stores. "Always ask what they're not telling you." "What about the people in the cars?" I asked my older self. "The families, the teenagers. What happens to them?" He tilted his head, considering the question. "They become part of the audience, permanent patrons. They get to watch movies forever, Danny. No more worries about jobs or bills or relationships. Just entertainment, night after night." That's not an answer. It's the only answer that matters. His patience was wearing thin, though he tried to hide it. "Look, I understand the hesitation. I felt the same way 3 years ago. But fighting this won't change anything except make the transition harder." I looked out at the lot again. The audience sat motionless in their cars, faces turned toward the screen where static now played. But if I focused on individual vehicles, I could see small movements. A hand adjusting a rearview mirror, someone reaching for a drink. Normal human gestures performed with mechanical precision. "They're still aware," I said. "Of course they're aware. They're watching movies, Danny. They're happy." "Are you happy?" The question seemed to surprise him. He looked down at his red jacket, brushing an invisible speck of dust from the gold braiding. "I'm content," he said finally. "I have purpose. I belong somewhere." "When's the last time you could say that about your life?" He was right about that part. My marriage had ended because Sarah said I was never really present, always thinking about somewhere else I'd rather be. My job at the multiplex in Chicago had been a paycheck, nothing more. Even here in Mooresville, I'd been marking time, waiting for something better to come along. But contentment wasn't the same as happiness, was it? "What if I want to leave? Walk away right now?" "The rules won't let you." He gestured toward the papers still folded in my pocket. "You read them, accepted them, followed them. That's a contract, Danny, binding in ways that go beyond legal documents." I pulled out Betty's list and read through it again. 7 simple rules, written in blue ink on yellow paper. Nothing about contracts or permanent employment or supernatural obligations. "I don't see any fine print." "It's not about what's written," he said. "It's about what you agreed to when you chose to stay. Every time you followed a rule instead of running, you made a choice. Those choices add up." Outside, the carnival music had stopped. The lot was silent, except for the distant sound of the white river flowing through the darkness. Even the corn had stopped rustling, as if the entire world was holding its breath. "Let me show you something," my older self said. He moved to the projection equipment and began threading a new reel of film. "This is what happens to people who try to leave after they've read the rules." The screen flickered to life, showing grainy footage of a man running through cornfield rows. The camera followed him from above, like drone footage, as he stumbled and fell and picked himself up again. He was heading toward the county road, toward escape. But the corn rows were endless. No matter how far he ran, how many turns he took, he never got closer to the road. The footage sped up, showing hours compressed into minutes, the man running in circles, getting more desperate, more panicked, until finally he collapsed from exhaustion. "That's Jim Morrison," my older self said. "Not the singer, different guy. He worked here in '78, tried to leave after his second week. The corn brought him back every time." On screen, the man was picked up by figures in red jackets. Other projectionists, other employees. They carried him back to the drive-in, back to the booth, where he was given a jacket of his own. "He's been our Thursday night operator ever since," my older self continued. "Perfectly happy now. No more anxiety about the outside world. No more decisions to make." The film changed, showing different escape attempts over the years. A woman who tried to drive away found her car's engine failing at the county line, forcing her to walk back. A man who called the police discovered they couldn't hear him properly. His words came out as static over the phone. "The drive-in has been here for 70 years, my older self explained. "It's grown roots, Danny, deep ones. This place has become something more than just a business. It's an entity unto itself, with its own needs and desires. What does it want? What any living thing wants. To continue existing, to grow, to be fed." He gestured toward the audience in their cars. "Every person who watches a movie here gives it a little energy, but employees give it more. Steady, consistent nourishment." I thought about Betty, making popcorn for 60 years, about all the projectionists who'd come before me, threading film night after night, decade after decade. "How many people work here?" "Currently?" 15 full-time employees." Betty runs concessions Monday through Friday. Jim handles Thursdays. Maria takes care of Saturdays. Each one serves their role perfectly, without complaint, without the messy complications of outside relationships or ambitions. 15 people trapped in jobs they could never quit, feeding some kind of supernatural parasite that disguised itself as entertainment. The thought made me sick. And if I refused to put on the jacket? You can't refuse. Not anymore. His voice held a note of genuine sympathy. But if you could, hypothetically, what would you go back to? Your apartment above the hardware store? Your minimum wage job? The divorce papers you still haven't signed? Every word hit home. I had nothing waiting for me in the outside world. No family, no friends who'd noticed my absence, no career prospects worth mentioning. The drive-in had offered me more stability than I'd had in years. But it wasn't real stability. It was surrender disguised as security. I want to try something, I said, moving toward the projection equipment. Danny, don't. I ignored him and began threading a new film reel, one I'd brought from the storage room earlier. Not a horror movie or a drama, but a documentary about corn farming in Indiana. Boring, educational, the kind of film that would put a normal audience to sleep. The older me watched with growing alarm as I started the projector. That's not going to work. The audience expects horror films on Friday nights. They need the fear, the adrenaline. Maybe they need something else, I said, focusing the lens until the image was sharp. The screen filled with footage of tractors harvesting corn, farmers discussing soil conditions, agricultural experts explaining crop rotation. Mundane, everyday reality. The exact opposite of the supernatural horror the drive-in seemed to thrive on. The effect was immediate. The cars in the lot began to shake, engines turning over by themselves. The phantom lights flickered and dimmed. The older version of myself started to fade around the edges, becoming translucent. "Stop," he said, his voice distorting like a record played at the wrong speed. "You're hurting them." But the people in the cars weren't acting hurt. They were acting confused, looking around as if waking from a dream. The teenager in the Camaro blinked several times, her eyes shifting from white back to their normal brown. She turned to her companions, saying something I couldn't hear from the booth. The documentary droned on, showing footage of the Kerner farm during daylight hours. Normal, rational, completely unglamorous reality. The kind of truth that supernatural things couldn't digest. Danny, please. My older self was barely visible now, his red jacket flickering like a TV with bad reception. You don't understand what you're doing. Without the drive-in, these people have to go back to their real lives, their problems, their pain, their ordinary disappointments. Maybe that's better than being trapped in someone else's dream. He opened his mouth to argue, but his voice made no sound. A moment later, he disappeared entirely, leaving only the red jacket crumpled on the chair. The cars in the lot were starting to move. Real headlights came on, real engines turned over, and real people began driving toward the exit. The phantom vehicles had vanished completely, and the supernatural atmosphere was lifting like fog in sunlight. But something was fighting back. The screen flickered, trying to return to its supernatural programming. The booth shook, and I could hear angry voices rising from below. Not human voices, but something older and hungrier. The drive-in wasn't going to let me go without a fight. The booth lurched sideways like a ship in rough water. I grabbed the projector to keep it steady, but the entire metal structure was swaying on its supports. Outside, the last of the legitimate cars were reaching the exit, their taillights disappearing into the night. The lot was nearly empty now, just gravel and the lingering smell of exhaust. The documentary kept playing, its narrator discussing soil pH levels, in a calm, academic tone. But the image was fighting me. Sections of the screen flickered between corn statistics and glimpses of something else. Fragments of the horror films that had played here over the decades, bleeding through like double-exposed photographs. A voice spoke from directly below the booth, loud enough to rattle the windows. Daniel. Not my older self this time, but something deeper, older. The voice of the drive-in itself, speaking through whatever mechanism had powered its supernatural influence for 70 years. You have broken the contract. I leaned over the projection controls and cranked up the documentary's volume. The narrator's voice boomed across the empty lot, explaining the economic impact of modern farming techniques on rural Indiana communities. Boring, factual, aggressively normal. The booth shook harder, threatening to tear loose from its mounting posts. Tools and film canisters rattled off their shelves, crashing to the floor around my feet. But the projector kept running, feeding reality onto the screen frame by frame. The others need you to stop. For the first time since this nightmare began, I laughed. The others can speak for themselves if they want me to stop. They cannot. They are part of us now. But even as the voice spoke, I could see movement in the shadows around the concession stand. Figures in red jackets were emerging from places that shouldn't have been able to hide them, from behind popcorn machines, from inside supply closets too small to hold a person. The trapped employees, the ones who'd been feeding this thing for decades. They moved slowly, reluctantly, like people walking through water. Betty led them, still wearing her vintage uniform, but her movements lacked the fluid grace I'd seen on the screen earlier. She looked tired, ancient, like someone carrying a weight too heavy for her shoulders. "Help us," she called up to the booth, and this time her voice was completely her own. No supernatural influence, no alien cheerfulness. Just Betty Hoffman, exhausted after 60 years of involuntary service. The other employees gathered behind her. 15 people wearing red jackets, ranging in age from teenagers to elderly men. Some I recognized from old photographs in the office. Others were completely unfamiliar, probably dating back to the drive-in's earliest years. All of them looked up at the booth with expressions of desperate hope. "The documentary!" Betty shouted. "Keep it running! It's working!" "No." The drive-in's voice shook the ground itself, making the gravel dance like water on a speaker cone. "They belong to us. They have always belonged to us." But the employees were moving more freely now, gathering around the base of the booth's support tower. Their red jackets were fading, colors leaching out like watercolor in rain. Underneath, they wore normal clothes, work shirts, jeans, the kind of outfits real people chose for themselves. Jim Morrison, the man who'd tried to escape in '78, looked up at me with eyes that were no longer white. "The film storage room," he called. "There are others. Documentaries, educational films, anything that shows the real world." I understood. The drive-in fed on fantasy, on stories that transported people away from their everyday lives. Reality was poison to it. The more mundane and factual, the more toxic. I rushed to the storage cabinets and started pulling out reels. Most were horror films and science fiction, but I found a small section of educational materials buried in the back. Films about Indiana history, nature documentaries, a driver's education film from 1987. The drive-in sensed what I was doing and fought back with everything it had. The booth tilted at a dangerous angle, threatening to topple over. The walls creaked and groaned, metal fatigue setting in after decades of supporting weight never meant for this kind of stress. But the employees below had found their strength. They formed a human chain, passing up film reels hand over hand. Betty climbed the swaying ladder with an agility that defied her apparent age, carrying an armload of documentaries. "Hurry," she said, setting the reels beside the projector. "It's getting desperate. When these things get desperate, they get dangerous." I switched reels, loading the nature documentary about White River wildlife. The screen filled with footage of raccoons and deer, completely ordinary animals doing completely ordinary things. The supernatural interference lessened immediately. "How long have you been aware?" I asked Betty while threading the next film. "Aware that I was trapped? About 20 years, but I couldn't do anything about it alone." She helped me feed the film through the projector's mechanisms. The drive-in's control weakens during daylight, but it never goes away completely. We're all connected to it, like insects in a spider's web. What changed tonight? You changed tonight. You chose reality over fantasy. She smiled, and for the first time since I'd known her, the expression reached her eyes. Most people want to escape their lives. You decided to embrace yours, even if it wasn't perfect. The new documentary started playing, footage of the White River during different seasons, narrated by a park ranger discussing local ecosystem preservation. More reality, more truth, more poison for the supernatural parasite that had been masquerading as entertainment. The drive-in's retaliation was immediate and vicious. The screen began to crack, hairline fractures spreading across the massive surface like a shattered windshield. The speakers screeched with feedback, then went silent. The booth's support posts groaned under stress that should have toppled the entire structure. But something else was happening too. The air was getting lighter, cleaner, like stepping outside after being trapped in a stuffy room. The oppressive atmosphere that had hung over the theater was lifting, dissipating into the October night. "It's working," Betty said, looking out at the lot. "Look." The gravel was changing color, shifting from the artificial gray I'd grown accustomed to back to its natural brown. The paint on the concession stand was peeling away, revealing older paint underneath. Colors that matched the vintage photographs I'd seen of the drive-in's early years. Most importantly, the corn was moving naturally again. Just wind pushing through the stalks, creating the soft, rustling sound that had been missing since the supernatural influence took hold. "How do we finish it?" I asked. "We show it the truth," Betty said. "All of it. Every boring, wonderful, complicated bit of reality until it can't digest anymore." I loaded another reel, the driver's education film. Black and white footage from the 1980s showing proper turning techniques and parallel parking. The kind of educational material that had never entertained anyone, designed purely to convey information. The screen's cracks spread faster, and I could hear something like screaming coming from the speakers despite their apparent failure. Not human screaming, but the sound of something ancient and hungry being forcibly expelled from a place it had called home for decades. The employees in the lot were changing too. Their red jackets had completely faded away, leaving them in their own clothes. More importantly, they were talking to each other. Actual conversations. Not the mechanical interactions I'd witnessed earlier. They were becoming human again. "There's one more thing," Betty said, her voice hesitant. "The drive-in isn't just going to disappear. When something like this dies, it leaves, remains." "What kind of remains?" "Memories, experiences, pieces of everyone who ever worked here or watched movies here." She gestured toward the fracturing screen. "All that energy has to go somewhere." As if summoned by her words, shapes began emerging from the cracks in the screen. Not monsters or ghosts, but fragments of moments. A child's laughter during the cartoon, a couple's first kiss during the romantic scene, a group of teenagers screaming during the horror film. Decades of genuine human emotion, trapped and distorted by the drive-in's supernatural hunger. The fragments swirled around the lot like leaves in a whirlwind, but instead of feeling threatening, they felt nostalgic, bittersweet. These were real memories of real people who'd found joy in this place before it became something else. Let them go, I said, switching to the final documentary, a film about seasonal changes in rural Indiana. They deserve to be free too. The last educational film played out in silence, the speakers permanently damaged. But I could see the footage clearly. Farmers harvesting corn, families preparing for winter, children playing in falling leaves. Life as it actually was, not as fantasy pretended it could be. The screen's final crack split it completely in half. The two sections fell forward with a crash that echoed across Morgan County, probably waking people in Mooresville 2 miles away. The fragments of memory spiraled up into the night sky, dispersing like fireworks before fading into starlight. The drive-in's voice spoke one last time, so quietly I almost missed it. Thank you. Then silence. Real silence, broken only by the natural sounds of the October night in rural Indiana. Owls calling, insects chirping, the distant sound of traffic on the county road. Betty sat down heavily in the folding chair, looking every one of her 60-plus years for the first time since I'd known her. Around the lot, the other employees were helping each other, checking on one another's well-being like people waking up from a shared nightmare. So what happens now? I asked. Now? Betty looked out at the wreckage of the screen, the scattered film reels, the empty lot that would probably never show another movie. Now we go home. For the first time in decades, we actually get to go home. I helped her down the ladder, both of us moving carefully in the darkness. The other employees were already walking toward the exit, supporting those who seemed unsteady after their long imprisonment. They moved like people remembering how to be human again. As we reached the concession stand, Betty turned back to look at the destroyed screen one last time. "Do you regret it?" she asked. "You could have been content here, safe, free from all the complications of real life." I thought about my apartment above the hardware store, my divorce papers, my complete lack of prospects or meaningful relationships. Everything that had driven me to accept this job in the first place. "No," I said, and meant it. Contentment isn't the same as happiness, and safety isn't the same as living. She smiled and handed me a set of keys, the real keys to the drive-in, not the supernatural bonds that had held us all. "Then you'd better lock up," she said, "for the last time." I locked the drive-in's front gates for the last time at 3:47 a.m. The chain felt heavier than usual, weighed down by finality rather than routine. Behind me, the lot stretched empty and broken, littered with debris from the collapsed screen and scattered film reels that would never be watched again. Betty had gone home to her house on Elm Street, a real house she'd apparently maintained for 60 years, despite never being able to stay there overnight. The other employees had dispersed into the darkness, walking toward lives they'd been forced to abandon decades ago. I wondered how many of them still had homes to return to, families who remembered them, jobs that might take them back. Jim Morrison had lingered the longest, standing at the gate with his hands in his pockets, staring at the wreckage. "I was supposed to get married," he'd said quietly. "June 1978. Janet Kowalski. No relation to you, I checked. She waited 2 years before giving up on me." "Maybe she's still in town," I'd suggested, but he'd just shaken his head. "She moved to Indianapolis in '85, married a lawyer, had 3 kids. I looked her up in the phone book years ago. back when I could still think clearly during the day. He'd turned to me then, his eyes clearer than I'd ever seen them. But I'm 58 years old now, Danny. In my head, I'm still 23. I don't know how to be the person I should have become. That was the real cost of the drive-in's hunger. Not just the years stolen, but the lives unlived, the growth stunted, the relationships that never had a chance to develop. 15 people had been freed tonight, but they'd lost more than time. They'd lost the opportunity to become who they were meant to be. I drove back to town through empty streets, past the courthouse where the clock showed 4:12 a.m. Mooresville looked different now, smaller somehow, as if the drive-in's supernatural influence had been magnifying everything about this place. The streets I'd driven for 3 years seemed narrower, the buildings less imposing, the whole town more ordinary and therefore more real. My apartment above Henderson's Hardware felt like a stranger's home. I'd spent so little time here, always rushing to get to the theater, always focused on the next night's screening. Now I could see it clearly, a sparse studio with a Murphy bed, a hot plate instead of a real stove, and exactly 3 photographs on the walls. All of them were from my wedding, back when I'd thought I understood what happiness looked like. I sat on the edge of the bed and called Betty's number. She answered on the second ring, as if she'd been expecting it. "Can't sleep either?" she asked. "Too quiet," I said. After 3 years of those sounds, the silence feels wrong. It'll take time to adjust. We all got used to being part of something bigger than ourselves, even if it was something terrible. She paused, and I could hear her moving around her kitchen. "I'm making coffee. Real coffee, not that instant stuff from the concession stand. Want to come over?" Betty's house was exactly what I'd expected. Neat, comfortable, frozen in time somewhere around 1965. Doilies on the furniture, photographs of people I didn't recognize, a television that probably received 3 channels on a good day. But it felt lived in, personal, human, in a way the drive-in never had. "How long have you been aware?" I asked, settling into an armchair that had clearly been her husband's. "Really aware?" "About 15 years. Before that, there were moments of clarity, usually during winter when the theater was closed, but I could never hold on to the thoughts long enough to act on them." She handed me a mug of coffee that was better than anything I'd tasted in months. The drive-in needed us to be just conscious enough to do our jobs, but not conscious enough to rebel. "What will you do now?" "Live," she said simply. "I'm 73 years old, Danny. I have maybe 10 or 15 good years left, and I plan to use every one of them. My sister's been sending me letters for 40 years. I think I'll finally write back." We sat in comfortable silence, drinking coffee and watching the sun rise through her kitchen window. Normal light, normal colors, no supernatural interference. Just morning arriving in rural Indiana, the way it had for centuries before the drive-in existed and would continue long after its remains were cleared away. "What about the others?" I asked. "Jim's talking about going back to school, finishing his degree. He's got GI benefits from Vietnam that never expired. Maria wants to find her children. They'd be in their 30s now, but she thinks they might still be in the area. The younger ones, the ones who got trapped more recently, they'll probably have an easier time adjusting. And the town, what do we tell people?" Betty smiled over her coffee cup. "That the drive-in is closed permanently due to equipment failure. No one will question it. That screen was held together with prayer and stubbornness for the last decade. Most folks will just be sadly missed the final show." I thought about the families who'd brought their children to see Disney movies. The teenagers who'd snuck in their first beers during horror films. The couples who'd used the back row for privacy. All those genuine moments of connection and joy, mixed in with the supernatural manipulation. "Do you think it was always evil?" I asked. "No," Betty said thoughtfully. "I think it started as something else, a place that genuinely brought people together, gave them shared experiences. But somewhere along the way, it got hungry. Started wanting more than just ticket sales and concession revenue. Started wanting the people themselves. Like a drug addiction. Exactly like that. It needed bigger and bigger fixes to satisfy itself. First, it was just the energy from the audience. Then it needed employees. Then it needed to trap them permanently." She set down her mug and looked out at the sunrise. Maybe if someone had intervened earlier, found a way to feed it healthy experiences instead of fear and dependence. But that was speculation now. The drive-in was gone, and we were left to pick up the pieces of lives that had been on hold for decades. I spent the rest of the morning at Betty's house, helping her go through boxes of mail she'd never been able to read properly. Letters from relatives, bills that had somehow been paid despite her supernatural imprisonment. Notices from the town about property taxes and zoning changes. The ordinary bureaucracy of life, continuing even when life itself had been interrupted. Around noon, I drove back to the theater one last time. In daylight, the damage looked even worse. The collapsed screen had crushed several rows of speaker posts, and broken glass covered the front third of the lot. Film reels were scattered everywhere, their contents exposed to sunlight and already beginning to deteriorate. But the cornfields looked healthier, greener, as if some blight had been lifted. The Kerner farmhouse in the distance had smoke rising from its chimney. Normal smoke, not the eerie mist that had sometimes accompanied the drive-in supernatural activities. I was collecting reusable equipment when a Morgan County Sheriff's deputy pulled up to the gate. "You the projectionist?" he asked, stepping out of his cruiser. "Was. Place is closed now. Figured as much when I saw the screen. We got about 30 calls last night about some kind of explosion out here. You know anything about that?" I gestured at the wreckage. Old equipment finally gave out. Been expecting it for months. He nodded, making notes in a small pad. "Anyone hurt?" "No injuries, just property damage. Insurance gonna cover it?" I looked at the destroyed screen, the damaged projection booth, the lot full of debris that would take weeks to clean up properly. "I doubt it. This place has been running on borrowed time for years." "Shame," he said, genuinely regretful. "Brought my kids here last summer to see E.T. Good Family Place. Hard to find those anymore." After he left, I spent another hour salvaging what I could. Most of the projection equipment was damaged beyond repair, but I found a few reels of classic films that had survived the chaos. Casablanca, The Wizard of Oz. It's a Wonderful Life. Movies that had probably been playing here since the drive-in's early days, before the supernatural influence took hold. I loaded them into my car, thinking Betty might like to have them as keepsakes. As I was leaving, I noticed something I'd missed before. The sign at the entrance, Starlight Drive-In, established 1952, had changed. The paint was peeling away, revealing older lettering underneath. Kerner Family Farm, established 1889. The drive-in had been built on farmland, but apparently the farm had never really gone away. It had just been covered up, hidden beneath layers of supernatural influence and artificial entertainment. Now, with that influence gone, the land was remembering what it used to be. I drove back to town with a strange feeling in my chest. Not quite happiness, but something approaching peace. The drive-in was gone. My job was over, and I had no idea what I was going to do next. But for the first time in years, that uncertainty felt like possibility rather than failure. The divorce papers were still sitting on my kitchen table, unsigned. I'd been putting off dealing with them, using the drive-in as an excuse to avoid making decisions about my future. But now, with no supernatural entity to blame for my avoidance, I had to face the truth. I'd been hiding from my real life long before I ever read Betty's rules. I signed the papers, addressed the envelope to my lawyer in Chicago, and walked to the post office to mail them. It felt like taking down a screen of my own, removing the artificial barrier that had been keeping me from moving forward. When I got back to my apartment, there was a message on my answering machine from Jake, the friend who'd told me about the drive-in job in the first place. "Hey Danny, heard through the grapevine that the drive-in's closing. Sorry, man. But listen, I've got another opportunity if you're interested. The multiplex in Bloomington needs an assistant manager. Real job, decent pay, normal hours. Give me a call. Normal hours, real job. No supernatural strings attached." I reached for the phone, then stopped. Maybe it was time to try something completely different. Maybe I'd been running projection equipment for so long that I'd forgotten there were other ways to make a living, other ways to find purpose. But first, I had to figure out who I wanted to be when I wasn't defined by someone else's rules. 3 weeks later, I was working at Henderson's Hardware, helping old Emil Kerner pick out fence posts when he mentioned buying back his family's land. "That drive-in's been an eyesore for years," he said, testing the weight of a cedar post. "Now that it's finally closed, the county's willing to sell me back the original 40 acres. Going to plant corn there next spring, like my granddad should have done." I hadn't expected the drive-in property to change hands so quickly, but apparently the county had been looking for an excuse to get rid of it for years. Too many insurance claims, too many complaints about noise and traffic, too much hassle for the small amount of tax revenue it generated. "What about the cleanup?" I asked. "Already started," Emil said, counting out cash for the posts. "Got a crew coming Monday to haul away the screen pieces. Rest of it I can handle myself. Few loads of gravel, some brush clearing. Land's got good drainage, good soil underneath all that blacktop." Through the hardware store's front window, I could see Betty walking down Main Street, carrying a small suitcase. She was heading for the Greyhound stop, catching the 2:15 bus to Indianapolis. Her sister had written back immediately, inviting Betty to stay as long as she wanted. 60 years is long enough to stay in one place, she told me yesterday. "I want to see what the world looks like when I'm free to leave whenever I choose." Henderson's Hardware was a good temporary job. Honest work, decent pay, and the owner didn't ask too many questions about my previous employment. I've been helping customers find screws and paint and electrical supplies, ordinary problems with ordinary solutions. No rules to follow except basic courtesy and knowing where things were stored. But it wasn't a career, and we both knew it. "You thinking about staying in Mooresville?" Henderson asked during my lunch break. He was a good man, probably in his 60s, who'd inherited the store from his father and expected to pass it on to his son eventually. "Not sure yet," I said honestly, still figuring things out. "Take your time. You're good with people, patient with the complicated orders, got a knack for this kind of work." He paused, reorganizing a display of paintbrushes. "But you've got the look of someone who's meant for something else." Jake had called twice more about the Bloomington job. The multiplex was expanding, adding 4 more screens, and they needed someone with projection experience to train the new staff. It was a good opportunity. Better pay than the hardware store, real benefits, the chance to get back into the entertainment industry without the supernatural complications. But every time I thought about threading film through projectors again, I felt something twist in my stomach. Not fear exactly, but a reluctance I couldn't quite explain. Maybe I'd had enough of other people's stories for a while. maybe I needed to figure out my own before I started showing anyone else's. That evening, I drove out to the old drive-in site. Emil's cleanup crew had been thorough. The collapsed screen was gone, the projection booth had been demolished, and the concession stand was just a concrete slab now. Fresh earth covered the lot where cars had parked for 70 years, and someone had already started plowing furrows for next spring's planting. But I wasn't alone. Jim Morrison was standing at the fence line, looking out over the transformed land. He was wearing civilian clothes, jeans and a flannel shirt instead of the red jacket, and he looked older somehow, more settled in his own skin. "Thought you might show up here," he said when I joined him at the fence. "How are you adjusting?" "Better than I expected." He leaned against the fence post, watching the sunset paint the sky orange and pink. "I enrolled at IUPUI, Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis, starting in January, working toward a degree in agriculture. Figured 45 years is long enough to be stuck in the past." "Agriculture?" "Always liked working with my hands, being outdoors." The drive-in made me forget that. Made me think the only thing I was good for was running projectors. He smiled, and it was the first genuine smile I'd seen from him. "Janet's doing well, by the way. I looked her up. Not to contact her, just to know. She's happy. 3 kids, 5 grandchildren, volunteers at the library. Good life. Does that hurt?" "Less than I thought it would. I spent 45 years regretting choices I never got to make. Turns out regret weighs more than acceptance." He glanced at me sideways. "What about you?" "Betty said you might be leaving town." "Thinking about it. Got a job offer in Bloomington, running projectors at a multiplex. But I don't know if I want to spend my life in dark rooms showing other people's stories." Jim nodded thoughtfully. "What would you do instead?" That was the question I'd been avoiding for weeks. In Chicago, I'd drifted from job to job without any real direction. The drive-in had been just another temporary position, a place to hide while I figured out what came next. But now, with the supernatural influence gone and my head finally clear, I could see that I'd been hiding for years. "I used to want to be a teacher," I said, surprising myself by saying it out loud. "Before I got married, before Chicago, before everything got complicated. High school English, maybe some drama classes. I thought about it seriously for a while." "What stopped you?" "Sarah thought it was impractical. Said teachers didn't make enough money, that we'd never be able to afford a house or kids on a teacher's salary." I kicked at a clump of dirt, watching it crumble. She wasn't wrong about the money, but she was wrong about what mattered. "Still think about it?" "More lately. Henderson's been letting me help with the high school kids who come in for shop class supplies. They're good kids, just trying to figure things out like everyone else. I like talking to them, helping them think through problems." Jim straightened up, brushing dust off his jeans. "So what's stopping you now?" "I'm 34 years old. Most people start teaching in their 20s, straight out of college. I'd be starting over from scratch." "I'm 58 and starting over from scratch," Jim pointed out. "Maria's 47 and just tracked down her kids in California. Turns out they never gave up looking for her. Tommy Breslin got out of the hospital last week, and he's talking about opening a woodworking shop." He was right. If people in their 40s and 50s could rebuild their lives after decades of supernatural imprisonment, I could certainly change careers at 34. "The education program at Indiana State is supposed to be good," I said, half to myself. "Terre Haute's only an hour from here. You could keep working at Henderson's part-time, take classes in the evenings and weekends." It was a practical plan, achievable, the kind of step-by-step approach that might actually work. but it also felt like the first decision I'd made in years that was completely my own, not influenced by someone else's expectations or supernatural manipulation. "What about you?" I asked. "Any second thoughts about the agriculture program?" "None," Jim said firmly. "I spent 45 years being told what to do, when to do it, how to think about it. Now I get to choose, and choice feels like the most valuable thing in the world." We stood there for a while, watching the last light fade from the sky. The cornfield that would replace the drive-in was still just turned earth, but I could imagine it green and growing, feeding people instead of feeding on them. A car pulled up behind us, Betty's ancient Buick, driven by someone I didn't recognize. The driver got out and walked toward us, and I realized it was Betty herself, but changed. Her hair was styled differently, her clothes were more colorful, and she moved with an energy I'd never seen before. "Thought I might find you two here," she said, joining us at the fence. "Couldn't leave without saying goodbye properly." "How's Indianapolis?" "Wonderful, overwhelming, terrifying. All the things I'd forgotten the world could be." She laughed, and it was a young woman's laugh despite her 73 years. "My sister's been showing me around, catching me up on 40 years of family news. Did you know I have 11 great-nieces and nephews? 11 children I never got to meet because I was stuck making popcorn for an audience that didn't really exist." "Any regrets?" I asked. "Only that I waited so long to leave." She looked out over the plowed field, then back at us. "Promise me something, both of you. Don't waste the time you've got left. Don't settle for good enough when you could have something real." Jim nodded seriously. "Already promised myself that." Betty turned to me expectantly. "What about you, Danny? What are you going to do with your freedom?" I thought about the job offer in Bloomington, the safety of familiar work, the temptation to slide back into old patterns. Then I thought about standing in front of a classroom, helping teenagers understand the power of stories, not to escape reality, but to understand it better. "I'm going to apply to Indiana State," I said. "Education program, high school English." Betty smiled and reached out to shake my hand. Her grip was firm, confident, the handshake of someone who'd reclaimed her own life. "Then I'd say we all made the right choice," she said. As her car disappeared into the darkness, Jim and I walked back to our vehicles. The night was clear and cold, full of stars that had been hidden by the drive-in's supernatural influence for decades. Real stars, real sky, real possibilities stretching out in every direction. "See you around, Danny," Jim said, climbing into his truck. "See you around." But we both knew we probably wouldn't. Not regularly. We'd been thrown together by supernatural circumstances, and now that those circumstances were gone, we'd naturally drift apart. That was normal, healthy, the way life was supposed to work. I drove back to town thinking about application deadlines and prerequisite courses, about the difference between hiding from life and preparing for it. For the first time in years, the future felt like something to move toward rather than something to endure. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in April, addressed to me at Henderson's Hardware. The return address read, Kerner Family Farm, Mooresville, Indiana, in handwriting I didn't recognize. Inside was a photograph and a brief note. "Danny, thought you'd like to see this. First crop in the new field is coming along nicely. Corn should be ready for harvest by September, God willing. Found something interesting when we were clearing out the old projection booth foundation. Figured you might want it. Best regards, Emil Kerner." The photograph showed green corn stalks reaching toward a blue sky, healthy and ordinary, exactly what farmland was supposed to look like. But what caught my attention was the small package wrapped in brown paper, taped to the back of the photo. I opened it carefully. aware that Henderson was watching from behind the counter. Inside was a strip of 35mm film, maybe 10 frames long, wound in a tight coil. The images were barely visible without proper magnification, but I could make out shapes, people sitting in cars, watching something off camera. That evening, I took the film strip to the Mooresville High School, where I'd been volunteering as an assistant drama coach while finishing my education coursework. The photography teacher let me use her enlarger to examine the frames properly. What I saw made me smile. The images showed the drive-in's audience from sometime in the 1960s, based on the car models. Families sitting together, children perched on car hoods, teenagers sharing popcorn in convertibles. Real people having real experiences, before the supernatural influence took hold, before entertainment became consumption, became imprisonment. In the final frame, barely visible in the background, stood a young woman in a concession stand uniform. Betty Hoffman, maybe 18 years old, smiling as she handed popcorn to a little girl through a car window. She looked happy, genuinely happy. Not the artificial contentment I'd seen during my nights at the theater. I kept the film strip in my wallet, a reminder that the drive-in hadn't always been a trap. For its first decade, maybe longer, it had been exactly what it appeared to be. A place where people came together to share stories under the stars. The following week, I got accepted into Indiana State's education program. Henderson threw a small celebration at the hardware store, complete with cake from the diner, and congratulations from half the town. I'd been nervous about the community's reaction to my career change, but Mooresville seemed to approve of the idea of a local boy becoming a teacher. "We need people who understand this place," Henderson said while cutting the cake. "Too many of our kids leave for the cities and never come back. Maybe having a teacher who chose to stay will make a difference." I hoped he was right. During my volunteer work at the high school, I'd met teenagers who reminded me of myself at their age, uncertain about the future, looking for something to believe in, torn between wanting to escape and wanting to belong. Maybe I could help them see that you didn't have to choose between having dreams and staying grounded in reality. On my last day at Henderson's Hardware, I drove out to the Kerner farm one final time. The corn was ankle-high now, planted in perfect rows that stretched to the horizon. Emil was repairing a fence near the road, and he waved when he saw my car. "How's the teaching program going?" he asked, setting down his hammer. "Good. Challenging, but good." I looked out over the growing corn. "Thank you for the film strip. It was a good reminder." "Reminder of what?" "That some stories have happy endings, even when it doesn't seem possible." Emil nodded thoughtfully. "Land remembers, you know. Good times and bad times both. But if you treat it right, give it what it needs, it'll grow whatever you plant." As I drove back toward town, I thought about stories and growth. About the difference between entertainment that transported you away from life and stories that helped you understand it better. In the fall, I'd be standing in front of my first classroom, helping students explore literature, encouraging them to write their own narratives. But tonight, I had homework to finish, lesson plans to write, student teaching requirements to complete, my own story to continue. Real work, real purpose, real choices made freely. The corn behind me rustled in the evening breeze, healthy and growing, fed by soil that had finally been allowed to remember what it was meant to nurture.